Okay, so I'm really delighted to be here with you today, and I'm very anxious to hear your thoughts about the material that I'm going to present to you. My mandate in the report that I wrote for JPPI on the delegitimization of Israel and Israel attachments among young adults, the college campus, and other contributing factors was actually sketched out in this document, towards 2030 Strategies for the Jewish Future, which defined the delegitimization of Israel on college campuses, and then suggested a project of mapping out the key features, main actions, intersections, methods of delegitimization, main areas and tools, and especially thinking also about literature, art, and culture, as well as the academy. And that actually worked together in a very significant way with research that I was already involved in doing, looking at American Jews in their 20s and 30s, specifically the leadership of the American Jewish community in the 20s and 30s. And by leaders, we were looking especially at people who had begun innovative enterprises of their own. Innovative enterprises in the organizational world, in other words, creating new organizations, some of them social justice organizations, but not all of them, creating new congregations, independent minyanim, which is quite a phenomenon in the United States for people in their 20s and 30s, artists, writers, musicians, and also business entrepreneurs. So people who had shown innovative leadership were the specific subject of the research that I was already doing. And immediately when I started working on the project of looking at delegitimization on college campuses, I saw that my subject was going to be not just what is happening in terms of delegitimization from the outside, but also what is the receptivity of young American Jews? What is happening when these delegitimization attempts actually reach the young people? What's going on in the minds and hearts of the young people, which really affects the way in which they respond to these delegitimization efforts? And I would say that of the materials that I wrote, my analysis of the younger people is something that's new, that's fresh. Delegitimization is being documented by a number of different entities. In the United States, the Anti-Defamation League, in Israel, the Reut Institute. I mean, there are many, many places where you can find documentation about delegitimization, but I think that combining that with what's happening with younger American Jews is a new approach, and I think that it is important. Delegitimization, as you know, occurs on many college campuses. Some analysts have tried to find patterns as to where it's more likely to happen. So, for example, some people have suggested that it's more likely to happen on smaller, more isolated campuses. I would say, from what I'm seeing, that that's not necessarily true. That maybe in terms of the larger patterns, smaller campuses are more likely to be affected, but it happens enough times on large urban campuses that we can't just so easily make that clean pattern. It really depends on many factors what traction delegitimization has. If you're on a campus where there are a few energetic, self-righteous, influential faculty members who are out to delegitimate Israel, it will happen on big campuses as well. And we see the examples of rabid anti-Israel activity on campuses like Berkeley and Columbia, which aren't exactly small, and Concordia in Montreal. Which is, in Montreal, is a particularly interesting example, as is Columbia, because there you're talking about urban areas where there's a very strong Jewish population that doesn't seem to prevent that from happening either. So I think it's something that we need to be alert to. We can't just say, oh, well, it's a big campus, it's not going to happen. If there are faculty whose political leanings run in that direction, and if there is a committed core of students who will cooperate, there are always people from the outside who can be brought in, and the combination of the three can create incidents. Now, some of the materials which are used are in fact created by enemies of Israel who deliberately work against Israel's very existence, and often deviously disguise their efforts by saying they're only working against the occupation. They have no issue with Israel. But in private expressions, these same people often say, well, they say that because they know that in the United States it's unacceptable to be against Israel proper. So this brings me actually to a very important point, which is the United States is actually different than many other places in the world. There's enormous support for Israel among the rank and file American voters. And often this is true even in states which don't have a particularly large Jewish population. It's actually rather remarkable, comparing the United States to European settings, for example. So I think that we need, when we think about this, to realize that I'm not saying it's not dangerous, and I'm not saying that we don't need to think about combating it, but I also think we need to realize that we shouldn't throw the United States and other diaspora communities into the blender and push the button that says blend, because then we are going to end up with an amalgam that isn't actually anything. So we have to look at, just as I said that on the college campus, the local situation is very important in how much the delegitimization will happen or won't happen. The same thing is true in terms of the ethos of the country. And right now, I'm not making any predictions for the future, but right now the United States is primarily pro-Israel, although there certainly are pockets of anti-Semitic feeling and anti-Israel feeling. And one can turn on talk radio and hear these pockets, but that's not representative of the majority of the country. One of the things that's really disturbing about the anti-Israel activities that go on many college campuses is that one can find materials that are used there which are not prepared by Israel's enemies, but which are instead taken out of context, lifted from valid concerns of people who are, shall we say, lovers and opponents of Israel at the same time. So people who are deeply committed to Israel, living in Israel and living outside of Israel, who are very, very concerned about policies that Israel has. And sometimes in delegitimization efforts, what happens is that the materials which have been prepared and promulgated by people who are in fact deeply committed to Israel and Israel's survival and Israel's improvement are pulled out of context and then used as evidence that Israel is the worst moral monster in the world. And this is kind of where this very, very well-publicized article by Peter Beinart in the New York Review of Books, this was his jumping off point, was he was talking about how disillusioned many American Jewish young people are by Israel policies. And he was accurate in saying that there is a fair amount of disillusionment. I think he was not accurate in the direction and the extremity to which he took his argument, but there is a core of truth in some of the things that he said, and we can find evidence for this all over the place. Here's just one picture. This is Morgan Siegel, whose father is from Israel, sported another Israeli for Human Rights sticker at a Senate meeting. Asked why she was supporting the bill to divest from Israel, Siegel said, because wrong is wrong and right is right, You can't escape one Holocaust and create another one somewhere else. So you see the extent to which the rhetoric sometimes reaches and the kind of moral equivalency that goes on, and it really does happen. So in that sense, Beinart was not inaccurate in saying that there are many young people who are profoundly disturbed by things that they think are happening in Israel. But it's a much more complicated situation than what he is than what he is describing, because he has a particular agenda and he has a particular argument that he wants to make. I gave you that example to show you how toxic the language gets. When people start using language of Nazis and apartheid and Holocaust, you know that they have crossed the line and they're no longer in a lover's quarrel with Israel. They're in a different place. So I'd now like to turn from the toxic brew of diverse delegitimization activities and rhetoric on college campuses to talk a little bit about the young American Jews who encountered these materials. And I'm going to preface this portrait that I'm going to present to you by saying once again that this is a very American portrait. There is a particular situation in the United States which I'm not sure was precedented in recent Jewish history. The United States is not like other diaspora communities because not only have American Jews absorbed many American values, not just into their lives, but also into their Jewishness. Okay, so American Jews, even from the Haredi community, have a lot of American concepts that they subscribe to. My favorite example of that is an ongoing insurrection in Kiryas Yoel, Satmar community, very insulated Satmar community, where a reporter from the New York Times came to ask, how could they be battling with each other? How could the younger people be battling against the older people? Don't they have respect for age and for rabbinic authority? And the young insurgent said, it is our democratic right to freedomly express ourselves. Now his grammar was terrible, but you see how much in the United States, which I think it may be different in Israel, that the democratic values haven't penetrated the Haredi community here to the same extent. But in the United States, there is that penetration. But it doesn't just go in the direction of America into Judaism. It also goes in the direction of Judaism into America. And that makes the United States different from even other English-speaking countries. Announcers, writers, public personalities use Jewish concepts, Yiddish words, all the time. And this is different than things were 40 years ago. So you have Cornel West talking about Tikkun Olam. You have non-Jewish announcers when something good happens saying Mazel Tov. There is this kind of love affair with Jewish culture on both a high level in terms of the most famous writer, like Philip Roth is kind of the national American writer, not just the national American Jewish writer, all the way down to lower levels in popular culture. And you see this in every aspect of popular culture, comics, performers, music. So what that means is because there's so much Jewishness out there, and there's so much Americanness inside the community, that the boundaries between what's Jewish and what's not Jewish are very, very porous. There's an enormous amount of fluidity. Now, this has happened culturally at other points. For example, in Weimar Germany, there was arguably something similar to that, but the difference is that there wasn't the same social interaction. So there was still social stratification between Jews and non-Jews. In the United States, there is enormous social fluidity. You don't have those structures, the stratification of Jews that separate them from non-Jews. You know that there have been a lot of discussions about intermarriage. Intermarriage grows in the United States not because Jews are trying to escape from Jewishness, but at this point it grows partially because Jews are perceived as very attractive marriage partners. That's why you have these high-profile intermarriages which have occurred recently among the relatives of heads of state. Non-Jews get onto a Jewish dating service called J-Date because they're interested in marrying Jews. It's at that level. So you've got social fluidity and cultural fluidity, and this has produced a younger generation which is different from their own parents and grandparents. In my interviews, I was involved in a research project looking at these younger American Jewish leaders, people in their 20s and 30s. One of the things I found is that they define ethnicity different than the way their parents and grandparents defined ethnicity. They got very upset when they would read, like Steve Cohen's study, which said that religiosity is stable, but ethnicity is declining. No, they said, our ethnicity isn't declining. We feel very ethnic. So I said, well, explain what you mean by ethnic. Well, one thing they do not relate to at all, which is why Steve said that ethnicity is declining. They do not relate to the concept of us and them. People who are inside the group, people who are outside the group. That is not only meaningless to them, it's repellent to them. What they relate to instead is Jewish culture. To them, all the aspects of Jewish culture is ethnicity. Jewish music, food, books, comedy, cultural performance, family styles, religious rituals are the primary expressions of their ethnicity. Now, this isn't as off the wall as it might sound, because there are actually two different sociological approaches to what defines ethnicity. One approach, which has been the most dominant one recently, is that a group is distinctive when the boundaries between people inside the group and the people outside the group are very clear. Strong boundaries make for group distinctiveness. But there's another approach which says that what makes a group distinctive is the cultural distinctiveness of that group. How is that group in terms of tochen? How is it different from the groups around it? And that's where things like ethnic languages and behaviors and values and cultural expressions become very important. So the young Jews that I interviewed did not feel socially distinctive or different. They felt that there were enormous treasures within Jewish culture. What was one of the interesting things is they are hyper-aware of the fact that Jewish culture is not monolithic, and they're fascinated by the Jewish cultures of North Africa and South America and wherever the Jews have lived. They want access to all of those Jewish cultures. So it's quite different than a sort of Fiddler on the Roof nostalgia. They're really very, very interested in what I would call Jewish multiculturalism. But what they are turned off by, as one young rabbi said, is, and this is a direct quote, particularism of like, 6 million died, we need to protect ourselves, we need to get to Israel, we have to stick by our own. So this rabbi explained to me that to people in their age cohort, the world doesn't seem that threatening. They don't understand why Jews are so closed off. And many of them are resentful of a Jewish life and a Jewish experience that is insular, that's only worried about Israel or about the Jewish community or Jews in need. And another quote, young adults are looking for some more broad articulation of what it means to be as a Jew and a human being in the world. To engage not only the Jewish community, not only the Jews in Israel, but far beyond the Jewish community as well. Now this may have a familiar ring to you. This may sound, on the face of it, a little bit like the universalism that typified the Reform movement.